In the skies over Great Britain, a British Airways captain is hanging outside of his cockpit window, being held back on his belt by his fellow cabin crew members. How did he get there? Did he survive? And how did this very strange accident happen? Find out with me today as we take a look at the strange case of British Airways 5390. Subscribe so you won't miss any future aviation videos. Welcome to Airspace. On June 10, 1990, British Airways Flight 5390 departed from Birmingham Airport to Malaga, Spain. The flight was operated with a BAC-111, a plane that is no longer in service today, so bear with me as I show footage of other British Airways planes today. In the cockpit were 42-year-old Captain Timothy Lancaster and First Officer Alistair Atchison, aged 39. As the plane climbed through the blue morning sky, the flight crew started to relax after the takeoff, and the captain released his shoulder harness, keeping on his lap belt, which he loosened slightly. Just a few minutes later, as the plane passed through 17,300 feet, there was a loud bang and the plane immediately filled with mist and the temperature dropped from 23 degrees to minus 17 degrees in an instant. Wind rushed through the cockpit, filling it with all kinds of papers and debris from the cabin interior. Also, the cockpit door was detached from its frame and was blown inwards and came to rest on the center console of the cockpit, located between the pilots. When he looked to the left in shock, First Officer Atchison could not believe his eyes. The captain was gone from his seat and the captain's windshield was missing. The body of the commander was hanging outside of the cockpit, suspended only by his knees, which were hooked on the flight controls. This must have been an otherworldly sight to see. Since the captain's departure had moved the control column by a lot, the autopilot had disconnected by design. Now, the first officer had to regain control of the aircraft and initiated an emergency descent to an altitude where breathing would be possible without an oxygen mask. Meanwhile, the air steward that was working just outside the cockpit had immediately seen the disaster unfold and rushed to the flight deck. He immediately proceeded to hold on to the captain, who appeared to be slipping outside the cockpit. The other stewards entered the cockpit as well and removed the broken cockpit door and debris. The first officer was now transmitting mayday calls, but struggled to hear any response from air traffic control because of the loud rush of air from the outside. Eventually he was able to make contact and the controller directed him to Southampton Airport, a place the first officer was not familiar with. Therefore, the controller provided very detailed approach information, which was beneficial for the first officer. While he was flying the approach alone, the other stewards took turns holding on to the captain, as the task was very straining. They believed that he was dead at that point, since he had been exposed to the extreme cold and wind for almost 20 minutes. Still, they held on, hoping that he somehow had not died. Also, the first officer was worried that if the body was released, it might strike the aircraft and damage it critically. After some harrowing 20 minutes, the aircraft landed on Southampton's runway 02 and emergency services took care of the captain. They were surprised that he regained consciousness as he was being pulled back into the aircraft on ground. He was taken to a hospital with frostbite, bruising, fractures to his right arm, wrist and left thumb. He was also in shock, which is frankly quite understandable. Soon after the landing, investigators began the search for the cause of this strange accident that could have ended much worse. The windshield and its attachment bolts were found soon below the flight path of the plane, and the cause of the accident was found pretty quickly. The bolts that were found were not the correct ones. Let's look at the windshield of the BAC-111. Each windshield is attached to the aircraft with 90 bolts that have a specified part number. In this case, the part number for the used bolt should be A211-8D. However, the investigators found 84 bolts with the specification 8C and 6 bolts with the specification 7D. So, 84 of those 90 bolts were 8Cs instead of 8Ds. The problem with the misuse of these bolts is that the 8Cs are 2/3 of a millimeter smaller in diameter than the correct 8Ds, and the 7Ds are 2.5 millimeters too short, but in correct diameter. These minor deviations from the standard specification sound like they are minimal and would not have a greater effect. But the forces from cabin pressurization are greater than one might think. A standard windshield is subjected to an outward pushing force of over 20,000 Newton in flight. That is the equivalent of about 25 men standing on it at the same time. The investigators took a closer look on how the windshield replacement was undertaken 27 hours before the accident. They found that a single engineer had replaced the windshield during his night shift. The man was a very experienced mechanic with over 33 years on the job. When he saw the task at hand, he first consulted a manual since he had not replaced the windshield in over 2 years. He recalled that the task was quite simple, and the manual seemed to confirm this, since the task was listed as not a vital point. He removed the windshield without any problems and then proceeded to get replacement bolts, since the ones he had removed from the frame were damaged either by corrosion or the act of removing them. The individual bolts do not hold markings on them, so the engineer took one of the bolts he removed from the defective windshield with him. In fact, this bolt was a 7D, not an 8D, so one that was slightly too short, but in the correct diameter. For some reason, the wrong kind of bolts had already been fitted once, but the fact that they were just a little shorter apparently did not lead to any failures up to that point. When the engineer wanted to get new bolts, he found that there were only 4 items left, but he needed almost 90. While he was rummaging through the part drawers, the store manager came to check on him. This man, also very experienced, recalled aloud that he thought 8Ds were required to fix a windscreen, not the 7Ds the engineer was looking for. Neither of the men pressed the matter, and the engineer left to check for bolts in another warehouse. There, he checked the labels of the respective drawers, but found the labels old and worn. Also, the place was illuminated badly and he had forgotten his reading glasses. Therefore, he selected what he thought were the appropriate bolts by look and feel of the parts. Satisfied, he returned to the aircraft and started to secure the window with the incorrect bolts he had retrieved. He had to lean over the aircraft to secure the bolts in the middle of the aircraft, and he later testified that he could not really see what he was doing and tightened the parts by feel. Had he been able to see better, maybe he would have discovered the obvious mismatch between bolt and countersink. All in all, it could not be determined why the engineer had acted in this way. He was described by his colleagues and pilots as being a highly appreciated senior member of the maintenance team that worked very diligently. After the accident, the aircraft was repaired and flown for another 11 years until it was scrapped. Captain Lancaster completely recovered from his injuries and returned to flying 5 months after the accident. He retired from British Airways in 2003 and went on to fly for EasyJet until he retired from commercial piloting in 2008. First Officer Atchison retired from British Airways shortly after the incident, joined Jet2 and remained flying until he made his last commercial flight on a Boeing 737 on his 65th birthday in June 2015. A similar incident happened in May 2018, when the first officer's windshield of a Sichuan Airlines Airbus A319 shattered at cruising level somewhere over China. Parts of the autoflight control system were ripped off and left the aircraft, leading to several failures. The first officer was injured, but fortunately later recovered. Due to several electrical failures, the autopilot of the plane failed and the captain had to completely hand fly the plane over high mountainous terrain until a safe landing could finally be made in Chengdu, about 35 minutes after the blowout. The reason behind this windshield failure was another one though. Moisture had formed inside the window due to a broken seal, and electrical arcing could take place inside the heating layers of the windshield, leading to tension inside the glass. When this tension became too high, the window shattered. In the aftermath of the British Airways event, several recommendations for maintenance personnel training and standardization were issued. Also, after the Sichuan accident, the checklist for cracked windshields in flight was changed. As a first safety measure, before one does anything else, the pilots must strap themselves in tightly. I hope you liked this week's video. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss any future episodes. See you next week.